Good afternoon. Thanks all for joining, folks. This is Tom Davis with the Office of Recapitalization here at HUD. And today we're going to be doing an overview of the revised RAD notice, revision 3, and that was issued on the web in January and published in the Federal Register a few days after that. And we are going to go through a bunch of elements on the slideshow in providing an overview of the notice, and also we'll be taking questions at the end of the session. When we get to the taking questions, folks, when we get to that part of the presentation, for those of you who have a speaker and are using the speaker in your computer, unless your computer also has a microphone, we will not be able to hear you. So those of you who are looking at the slides on your computer and have also called into the conference line, you will have a PIN that you'll enter in that ties the computer system and your audio telephone conference line call-in together, so that we'll be able to call on you and unmute your line. So that works fine for the folks on the telephone. But if you are relying entirely on your computer, make sure that you either have a microphone or that you call into the conference line if you want to ask a question verbally. Otherwise, you can raise your hand on the webinar mechanism and write in a question in the question box. Are the two ways to do it. So enough of logistics. Well, Will Levy will be doing most of the presentation. I did just want to sort of do a quick intro as to why there was a revised notice. A lot of the pieces in the revised notice reflect lessons that we've learned over the last year and a half, pushing 2 years since revision 2 came out. We have also sort of had a running little list of cleanups and things, and a few things that had been policy discussions within the department that had been sort of building up as issues that should be addressed in the RAD notice. So this revised notice is to some extent a grab bag of a lot of different things. It builds on lessons learned, builds on the program successes. We've included some elements of new provisions that we hope will make it easier or facilitate transformation and conversion of these properties. And so it's a grab bag of a variety of different origins for the different changes. There is a black line or marked changes version of the notice on the RAD website, so that you don't have to be guessing whether the change happened, and so you can find the changes easily. So we hope that's helpful to folks as you get up to speed with what's different in revision 3. There are most of the changes are in the first component in the piece focused on the public housing conversions. We've tried to simplify some program requirements. We've tried to introduce some flexibilities. We've tried to strengthen some of the information flow to residents, a variety of cleanup issues. And we'll go through we'll go through the first component in a fair amount of detail today. And then the second component, the biggest changes involve some rent setting options in the second component. And we'll have a training, I think also at 3 o'clock on Thursday, to go over the second component changes. So with that, I will turn the microphone over to Will Levy here in the Office of Recapitalization. And thank you very much for joining the call. And the team will be trying to get you up to speed on revision 3, and then folks on the team will be taking your questions after Will finishes up the presentation. So thank you very much, and look forward to good questions.
Great. Thank you, Tom, and thank you for your leadership in getting this notice to publication. I just want to point out for all our listeners and participants that we're also joined here with Greg Byrne of the transaction team and Bev Rudman of the closing team, who will be providing commentary and insights from their perspective, but also available for questions so that we can answer as a team and jointly. Okay, so diving in. So the first high-level point is on implementation. The revisions on Section 1 of the notice, the public housing section, they are all effective now. There was a period over the last 30 days, to be precise, where certain provisions, the eligibility and selection criteria, were not yet effective. But starting today, February 21st, all provisions in the notice are effective. We have also solicited public comment, which are also due today, which so far have been quite helpful. And so if any of the comments that we receive lead us to reconsider any of the changes that were made to the notice, HUD will then issue a separate notice in the future. But barring that, everything you read in the notice is effective. Okay, so first let's dive into those selection and eligibility criteria as there are three significant things going on here. So the first thing is we've consolidated the priority categories for new applications. In revision 2 of the notice, we had created 6 priority categories, or 6 categories of prioritization, and frankly, it was just a bit too confusing, both for applicants and for HUD administration. And so we've simplified that. We've consolidated those 6 categories into just 2 categories: a high investment category and then an all other category. The high investment category includes deals with full or partial demolition, with new construction, any choice neighborhoods planning or implementation awardees, promise zone locations, or other locally recognized neighborhood revitalization plans, as well as properties that have been approved for Section 18 demolition or disposition, but that are still eligible and are planning to pursue RAD. Then every other application is in the second category, so is on equal footing. And that is effective today. So we've gone through a process over the last few months to make sure that the waiting list is well sorted through, and lots of chaps have gone out. And starting today, folks will see, I think soon we'll be able to post a consolidated waiting list that shows folks' updated position. But still, everybody's, anyone who has been on the waiting list and is still on the waiting list, the date they originally submitted their application will obviously still be recognized and respected. Next change in selection and eligibility criteria is another significant one. We've created an opportunity for PHAs, instead of submitting an application when a waiting list is formed, they can submit a simpler letter of interest. This is really just to say, we understand when there's a waiting list, the PHA's motivation to start meeting with residents before they even have a chance of participating or talk to their boards when participation might be, actual real participation might be a little ways out, might be too early. So we've created an opportunity for PHAs instead to just give us a letter of interest, which tells us their name, the properties that they plan to submit for, and the units. And that letter of interest holds the PHA's spot in line. They go under the Category 2 in the prioritization scheme that I just described, but they've got those units locked in based on when that letter of interest was submitted. and when it comes time for them to submit actual applications, it'll live with the position of the letter of interest on the waiting list. If a PHA decided, well, I've got a letter of interest holding 1,000 units, but I've got one property that I need to move faster than that, they can submit a separate RAD application that might be let's say it's a high investment deal, and they would be categorized above anything on the in Category 2. But otherwise, a PHA is guaranteed at a minimum position of where that letter of interest lands in Category 2. And the last change in selection and eligibility criteria is related to Hope 6 projects, and this revision makes an entire Hope 6 project that was originally developed in phases on a contiguous site eligible for conversion under RAD as long as the earliest phase is greater than 10 years old. In other words, if you've got a Hope 6 site that was developed over 5 phases and 2 of the phases are over 10 years old and 3 of the phases are under 10 years old, but it's all really one project, then the entire project, the entire Hope 6 project is eligible for conversion. Because there's a lot to cover in these trainings, and we're going to be bouncing around topics, I'll actually take a break there and see if there are any questions on what we just discussed. And if anyone has raised their hand on the GoToWebinar or has submitted a written question that's pertinent to what we just discussed, we'll take a look. Okay, so the first question is will there be a copy of the PowerPoint presentation available? Yes, after this presentation, we'll post this as well as a recorded version of the presentation to our site. Those were the first 2 questions, actually. Great. We've also been asked what's the status of the waiting list right now. Well, it's recently, last we checked, it was about 18,000 units. We also have been able to make a number of awards recently. I don't know if we've got an updated count right now, but we will we'll be able to we'll post that when we're posting the updated waiting list. Then another question: when can the letter of interest be submitted? As of this morning, 12 a.m. So if anyone needs to step off of the webinar for a moment to hit send to get their letter of interest in, we totally understand. Again, this session will be recorded, so you can come back to listen. Okay, another question. Will letters of interest be posted as part of the waiting list? Yes, we'll. If a letter of interest, we'll put a PHA onto the waiting list, and therefore, whether a PHA submitted a real RAD application or a portfolio award or a letter of interest, those will all be. If a PHA is gotten onto the waiting list, that will be part of our public record. Another question for letter of interest, is there any prerequisite involved? Anything you need to do with respect to informing the public? No, there is all of those requirements to get board approval, have your resident meetings, talk with lenders and investors, has to happen before you submit an actual application, which, but preceding that, a letter of interest is all we need just to hold your spot on the waiting list. Part of the benefit to HUD of the letter of interest is we get a better gauge of PHA's interest in the program and the demand for it. But it does not in any way circumvent a PHA's responsibility to undertake the public process, the local public process, before submitting an actual RAD application. Okay, let's see. The one question: can a letter of interest place a project in the Category 1 waiting list if it would meet the qualifications for as a high investment project? The answer is no. If if a PHA has a project that is going to be a high investment project and wants to have that space on the waiting list, then it would need to submit an actual RAD application that would put it there. Otherwise, we're not collecting with the letters of interest information on whether any of the projects would qualify for a higher category. Okay. There's a question about RAD and choice neighborhoods and about the timelines. We have actually a majority of choice neighborhood implementation awardees are also using RAD. So we've actually gotten a lot better just in the last few years of combining the two programs. Greg, I don't know if, or Bev, if you guys want to chime in on this, but our basic premise is we totally respect that choice properties require a certain level of pre-development time, and we generally allow those the timing required in a choice property to kind of lead the way rather than impose our tighter timelines. Greg, anything to add on that?
Yeah, we definitely we assign a transaction manager from our office, but there's also driving it the program manager from the Choice Neighborhood Shop, and as you said, we really defer to the milestones in the Choice Neighborhood program that trump the RAD milestones.
Okay, a couple other questions. Does a multi-phase award secure a waiting list position the same as a letter of interest? Yes, if PHA can get properties and essentially a reservation of units on the waiting list in a number of ways. It could submit a RAD application for a single property. It could submit RAD applications in a portfolio award listing half of properties that it will submit applications for later. It could submit a RAD application with a multi-phase award that, for properties that will be developed over multiple phases. Or it could submit a letter of interest. And each situation, the letter of interest is really meant, I think, for PHAs that have a number of properties for which it would like to submit, and it hasn't gone through yet the local process of being able to prepare the application yet. A multi-phase award is really more appropriate, I think, when a PHA has a property that's redeveloping in multiple phases. Its first application oftentimes will meet the high investment category, and the remaining phases, which will be future applications, also will likely meet the high investment category, assuming you're redeveloping a site in multiple phases. And so there's slightly different vehicles to get the same thing. Okay, where do we send a letter of interest? Easy, that's radapplications@hud.gov. We'll be logging them there. And the side question, is this webinar just for conversion of public housing properties or PHA-owned properties, or does it cover the second component of RAD? No, this presentation is only about the public housing conversions. On Thursday, we'll have a separate webinar on the conversion of mod rehab, rent sub, and RAD properties. So please dial back in then. Question, do we need an application to elevate to the Category 1 on the waiting list? Yes, you need a separate application. What are the essential elements of the letter of interest? Those are detailed in the notice, but I believe it's the housing authority name, the properties you wish to apply for, or that you plan to apply for, the number of units, and the PIC development number, the AMP number. Is there a priority order for letters of interest versus RAD applications within two categories? So within the second category, letter of interest is ordered or is combined with or prioritized the same as any other application or multi-phase or portfolio award in Category 2. So they'll just be prioritized at that point by data submission. Question, would a Hope 6 property that's over 10 years old be categorized as Category 1 or 2? Any existing Hope 6 properties, assuming that it's not going to be demolished and rebuilt or doesn't otherwise meet the criteria for Category 1, will likely be a Category 2 property. Another question, does the change in eligibility criteria for Hope 6 properties have any impact on other mixed finance properties that have been developed? There is no restriction on the age of the eligibility for the for other mixed finance properties that were developed outside of Hope 6. There's no age limit there. So a mixed finance property could have been developed last year without Hope 6 funds and is eligible for conversion. Okay, we'll take a break from the questions and go back to presentation. So the next category to talk through are underwriting standards, loosely categorized. So the first batch of changes to discuss are around capital needs assessment. So revision 3 of the notice provides a new exemption of the CNA requirement for non-FHA transactions where the total assisted units will constitute less than 20% of the total units of the project. Such properties may also be exempt from the Excel tool used to establish a 20-year reserve schedule. Essentially, this is HUD saying if there are properties where there's going to be minimal HUD assistance, we're not going to underwrite it in the same way in terms of requiring a certain scope of work or replacement reserve amount. Please note, when we talk about assisted units, this is not just the units that will be converted through RAD, but may also mean other project-based vouchers, for example, that might be at the property. So if that total is less than 20%, it can be exempt. Please make sure to talk with, if you're in such a situation, to benefit from this, please make sure to talk with your transaction manager because any exemptions need to be confirmed. There are a few other additional clarifications in this section. One is that RAD does not require a utility consumption baseline for any buildings being demolished or newly constructed. And then there's also a statement in the notice that has the effect of clarifying that pending future guidance for PBRA or PBV properties, any additional categories of properties may be exempt from establishing, there may be additional categories that may be exempt from establishing a utility consumption baseline. So both multifamily and PIH are in a process of developing energy benchmarking requirements for their programs. And what this means is that if in developing those requirements there are categories of properties that are exempt from benchmarking, then they would also be exempt from establishing the utility consumption baseline in a RAD conversion. But since none of those policies are in effect yet, this statement just is in preparation for what might come. Okay, next page, acquisition proceeds. This part of the notice clarifies that a PHA is permitted to receive cash acquisition proceeds in excess of any seller take-back financing, but requires that those proceeds must be used for a term in the notice called, a new term in the notice called affordable housing purposes. Affordable housing purposes is actually a term we use in revision 2 of the notice for in a more narrow context, but have kind of adopted more broadly here. The definition is both in the notice and in fine print on this slide, but it's really affordable housing, pretty broadly defined. Such proceeds would need to be escrowed in accounts covered under general depository agreements, not not in any way controlled by HUD, or you don't need to request HUD approval to release the funds, but we do want them covered in an account covered under GDA. The next page, allowable developer fee. So previously, the notice had permitted, many PHAs were, the way the notice had previously been implemented, the developer fee, the maximum developer fee was calculated at 15% of total development costs. What this revision does is it lowers the maximum fee to 15% of total development costs, less any acquisition payments made to the PHA, less the developer fee, and less reserves. By the way, this is specific to the non-deferred developer fee, so that if there's a deferred portion of the developer fee, that would not be subject to cap. A minimum level is also established at the lesser of 15% of the total development costs without any offset, or $1 million. So that's to make sure we're not disincentivizing winners from smaller deals. And I should note that this 15% requirement or 15% restriction is only applicable to tax credit deals. For non-tax credit deals, I think it remains 10%. The scheduled release of the developer fee is removed. We used to have a certain time when the fees could be distributed. Instead, it's left to the PHA and its partners to propose in the financing plan. Please note, though, that these developer fee rules would apply to any closings where the RCC was issued by or before March 19th, and the closing occurs within 60 days of RCC issuance. So that is, if you already have your RCC, or if you're going to get your RCC and execute it by March 19th, and you close within 60 days without the issuance of the RCC, you could, the rules of revision 2 would apply. Okay. Next slide. So we've also added some additional flexibility to underwrite to new loan products. We provide one example in the notice, which is that balloon payments within 17 years of the date of the permanent debt financing could be permitted. But we've also broadly given ourselves some more authority to consider alternative new products without a waiver. Obviously, you would need to discuss this with your transaction manager, and I would be assessing whether the product poses any particular risk from one's perspective. A few more smaller items on underwriting standards to clarify that a single environmental review can cover both the demolition and new construction activity. We have added a definition of project just for transactional purposes that identifies a project as a structure, a group of structures that in HUD determination is appropriately managed as a single asset. We clarify that this is something we've done in a few cases, especially when affordable home loan bank monies come into the property after conversion. We clarify that HUD can provide prior consent to future anticipated financing, including any permanent financing, which is a conversion or takeout of construction financing, through approval of the RCC. So if you are aware of such sources that are going to be built into the deal, make sure you include that in your financing plan, and we can provide pre-approval of it in the RCC. And we'll stop there again as we hit another section, see if there are any questions. We have, okay. We have a few callers. Ready? Brian O'Toole, are you there? You're unmuted, or make sure to unmute your phone and feel free to ask your question. Brian?
Okay, I'm sorry. This is Cedric Brown. I'm in the office with Brian, and we should have been muted.
No, it's okay.
Thank you.
All right, we'll see if there are any other questions.
Well, can you go over the March 19th and 60-day thing again? So if you're before March 18th, there's no 60-day restriction.
Oh, for the developer fee. So we've got one question about the developer fee rules and the change, and when a PHA can abide or can follow the rules from revision 2, which would permit a higher developer fee in some cases. Answer is if for any PHA that has an RCC today or will receive an RCC before March 19th, and that closes within 60 days of that RCC issuance. RCC issuance is when the PHA executes the RCC. They can...
No, RCC issuance is when we... Okay, we'll talk about that later.
Then we can, then the PHA can follow the developer fee rules from revision 2 of the notice. See if there are any other questions. Okay, we have a question from Ron. Ron, you're on the air.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. My question was about the developer fee. You said something to the effect that it only applies, the 15% cap only applies to the undeferred portion of the developer fee?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so the deferred portion, that what's, I guess I'm a little,
so if
I'm not clear what the limit is.
So if the the non-deferred portion of the developer fee can be no more than 15% of total development costs minus reserves, acquisition, and the developer fee itself.
Okay, and there's no particular limit on the total developer fee?
No.
Okay, and then you said something about for a non-LIHTC transaction, it was 10% rather than 15%?
Yeah, that's what it's always been.
Okay, okay. That's my question.
Great, thanks, Ron. Any other questions? Got a question from Sarah Kapakow.
Hi, yes, hi, how are you? Hi, I see in 1.14 to the developer fee, there in section B, there's a line that says earned developer fees are not subject to any federal restrictions. So what exactly does that mean?
That means HUD does not dictate or restrict what those funds can be used for.
That's something that is sort of understood outside of sort of the HUD programs, particularly RAD and public housing and mixed finance. But oftentimes developer fees or the like, sometimes inside our public housing or mixed finance programs might be considered program income. So this is just a clarification to say there is no restriction on the use of those fees, those developer fees, as long as they're within the approvable limits.
Okay, so it's referring to the use as opposed to how much or the other limits that were discussed above. Okay.
That's right. It's not. That refers to once those fees are properly calculated. What are there any limits on what they can be used for?
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Any other hands raised and questions? Okay, let's see a few written questions. one question is, does the developer fee limit apply both to 4% and to 9%? The answer is yes. It applies to any tax credit deal. There's a clarification. Are you saying that if you defer the developer fee, there's no limitation? Yes, that's correct. If you're not collecting the developer fee as part of a transaction itself, the financing of the transaction itself, and you've deferred large sums of it for the subject to cash flow, then those deferred portions are not subject to any limit.
And of course, you may be bumping up against your own HFA or tax credit issuing agency's limits. But
there's a question: can you review the possible exemptions from the RAD tool one more time? Yeah. So simply put, if the assisted units of the property will be less than, it would be 20% or less of the total units of the property, then subject to approval from the transaction manager, the property wouldn't need the CNA to determine the necessary scope of work or to size the replacement reserves.
And also wouldn't be submitting the full financing plan that you'd be submitting for a traditional project. So we treat these truly sort of partially assisted properties differently, and sort of saying that we're largely going to treat them like the market's really sort of controlling or keeping those properties honest. So we don't ask for the full range of requirements as a way of trying not to scare away owners who are willing to take a percentage of units in their property.
Question back on the developer fee. What if your HFA allows a larger developer fee than HUD allows? Well, our requirements still govern or would govern in that situation. Same would be true if the opposite were the case, where HUD's limits were more generous than an HFA's limits, and in that case, the HFA's limits would need to be abided by as well.
Very often, where the HFA has a higher amount, we'll see transactions where they indeed defer that higher amount, so they're still, so the project is generating as much as possible.
There's a question: does the developer fee rule apply to the fees due to a developer partner? Yes, the amount of the developer fee that is being restricted is the total developer fee amount, regardless of how it's going to be distributed to partners. Okay. Why don't we go on to the next section? Okay, so again, another broad category, new flexibilities. Okay, starting, first thing is we've come up with another way in which PHAs might be able to enhance their rents above the current funding rents. This is already we allow a PHA that has that anticipates that it will receive future RHF, replacement housing factor, or DDTF, demolition, disposition, transition funding, to trade those funds in for an increase in the RAD rent. We also allow PHAs to, if they have accumulated RHF, DDTF, to use those funds in the development budget. Revision 3 allows PHAs also to use any accumulated RHF or DDTF to increase the RAD rent. And the calculation is very similar. It should be familiar to folks who've done this before. It's whatever the total undispersed RHF or DDTF amount is, divided by 20 years, divided by 12 months, divided by the number of units, is the per unit month amount that the rent can be increased. in exchange for increasing the rents, HUD would then recapture those funds from the housing authority. We should have further guidance on exactly how this works and the steps pretty shortly. Next item, we have eliminated the cap on the number of PBV units in each project. So just a little history. In the normal PBV program, project-based voucher program, there is a limit that no more than 25% of the units in a property can be assisted by the PBV contract unless the property meets certain exemptions about social services or for units for elderly or disabled individuals. Under RAD, we've raised that to 50% and kept those exception requirements. Last year, Congress passed and the President signed the Housing Opportunities Through Modernization Act, or HOPMA, which would largely have had the effect in RAD of eliminating the cap altogether. And so this notice just gets out just ahead of the HOPMA implementation and eliminates the cap. So there's no need anymore for PHAs to justify when the PBV contract will support more than 50% of the units of the property. Yes. So one question. One question from the audience is whether that's effective immediately, and yes, it is. We actually have a revised PBV contract. We have revised all of our forms that and they're available on the RAD website, www.hud.gov/rad. They're not yet on the resource desk because we're awaiting final approval, but some PHAs have asked whether they can use those forms, and in particular, it's helpful for this provision because the language there now reflects the elimination of this cap. This is really just to catch up with our practice, but we've expanded in the notice the conditions in which a public or nonprofit can demonstrate ownership or control. I won't go over all of these here today. It's more easier to follow in the red line, but these are all situations in which we've routinely approved these ownership and control structures and are just making sure that the public is aware and can plan accordingly as they're developing their partnerships. A few smaller items, or smaller to some anyway, or small to most, but maybe pretty impactful for some. We've modified when a project that's received the Section 18 approval is now permitted to be submitted for RAD. And those include if it is awarded but it's not yet executed a demolition contract, and if it has requested but did not yet receive tenant protection vouchers, it can still be eligible for conversion under RAD. We've also clarified that if a PHA has secured both Section 18 and RAD approval for a property, we used to say the PHA had 10 days to tell us which direction it was going to pursue. We realized that's really not enough time, so we changed that to 90 days. Related to moving to work agencies, or MTWs, we've removed the requirement that an MTW agency must have 2 or more RAD applications in order to supplement rents with MTW funds. And we've also eliminated the provision that had required alternative operating subsidy MTW agencies to use rents based on the operating fund rule, Part 990, for applications submitted within the last couple of years. Alternative subsidy MTW agencies would have instead now would have their RAD rents based on the subsidy they're actually receiving on their alternative subsidy. A couple more flexibilities. Previously, a PHA had to demonstrate that any de minimis reduction better serves residents. Now it can demonstrate that it benefits either the covered project or the operating viability of the PHA's RAD or public housing portfolio. Also related to de minimis, we've clarified that any property or proceeds received from the sale of any property that is released from the DOT under the de minimis exception must be used for affordable housing purposes. So in some cases, this doesn't happen much, but the de minimis units of PHA selected, or the units of PHA selected to be part of the conversion, but to not actually replace under the HAP contract, is a potentially severable parcel of land that has value that can be sold for some other use. And so essentially the requirement is that any of those sale proceeds must be used for affordable housing, or the land itself must be used to support affordable housing. We've also modified the provision related to when total tenant payment exceeds gross rent. Previously, in the last notice, we had already required that in such a situation where in the RAD rents, where they're often below market, if the rent and utilities the tenant is required to pay exceed the RAD gross rent, then the tenant would continue to pay 30%. Would continue to pay their TTP, 30% of adjusted gross income. What we've done in this notice is provide an exception that for the tenant would either pay 30% of adjusted gross income or the tax credit maximum rent if it's a tax credit property. And we've also, for PBRA conversions, said that such households may be required to be processed in tracks when the system can accommodate these situations.
Meaning they can't be now?
Right. Right now in tracks, the owners just identify the unit as a market rate unit and can't submit the tenant voucher, the 5059. A few more things. Revision 3 clarifies that well, there had been certain limitations on when transfers of assistance can occur to tax credit properties. That still exists, but we've clarified that when we talk about tax credit properties, we mean properties that are within their 15-year tax credit compliance period. The notice affirms that any management fees earned following conversion are not subject to any federal restrictions. And the notice also affirms, this is another one of those practices that we've always permitted whenever requested, but the PHAs may substitute projects in their portfolio award and switch projects between the active and pending portions of their portfolio. Or they can even convert multiple projects into a portfolio award if they haven't already. Most PHAs have already done this if they've needed to. Okay, we'll take another break, see if there are any questions on any of those new flexibilities. So one question is whether the RAD notice or any of its provisions are impacted by guidance that the administration has issued regarding the effective dates of policy actions made by various branches. No, we've clarified with our leadership that all of the changes in the RAD notice are effective as described. So everything is effective today. There's a question on RHF. If a property converted to RAD last year, can we still use our undispersed RHF funds to increase contract rents? Or is it just for future RAD properties? If a PHA has, if the PHA has not used its RHF to increase RAD rents before conversion, it's lost its ability to do so for that property, but could do so for any future conversions that they have. Another question. If TTP, this is for where TTP exceeds gross rent, let's say it's limited to the maximum tax credit rent, is it still subject to a phase-in increase? Yes. So those two provisions could apply simultaneously, where a tenant under Section 8 might pay something that is over the TTP, over the Section 8 gross rent. If that amount represents an increase over what they're paying now, their rent should be phased in over 3 or 5 years. The question, what happens to the project-based voucher when the tenant is a zero HAP for over 6 months? So in the regular project-based voucher program outside of RAD, if a tenant is a zero HAP for over 6 months, the PHA removes that unit from the HAP contract. That does not happen in the context of RAD. And for RAD, if a tenant is a zero HAP, that's because their TTP exceeds the gross rent, the unit stays on the contract. The resident retains all of the rights under that contract or as an assisted resident, and the tenant continues to pay 30% of their income. Just to point out, that's for PBV. That's just for existing households that are there at the time of conversion. Thank you, Greg. For new households that move in after conversion, they would need to be not only income eligible for the program at the right AMIs, but would also need to have a TTP that is lower than the gross rent, and if their TTP rises above the gross rent, the same 6 months provision that normally applies to the PBV program would apply. Clarification of what I just said about regarding zero HAP. Did that just apply to PBV or to PBRA? Okay, so I'll start this over again a little bit. So for PBV or for PBRA, any existing households that are at zero HAP would pay, or whose income grows to zero HAP, they would stay on the contract and would pay 30% of their income. Or if applicable, the tax credit maximum rent. For future residents, for PBV units, there need to be some HAP drawn on that unit, meaning they would need to have a TDP lower than gross rent in order to move in or to be eligible for the program. That's not true for PBRA. They can move in as long as they were income eligible, but even if there would be no HAP due on that contract unit.
And moreover, Will, in PBRA, if someone is over income, that they don't need any subsidy, that the assistant that unit doesn't leave the HAP contract. It stays on the HAP contract, even if that family circumstances change in 6 months, a year, 2 years, or if the family moves out. So PBRA is different from PBV in how it treats no HAP families.
Okay. Thank you, Greg. Just a request to go over one other point about Section 18 in RAD. So there's a couple of items that I highlighted. One that I think could probably be clearer. Revision 2 of the notice had previously identified a few triggers that would make a property that has been approved for Section 18 ineligible for RAD. One of them was if the PHA had requested tenant protection vouchers, and another was if the PHA had awarded a demolition contract. We've clarified, or we've modified that modestly in this notice and said property that receives Section 18 approval would still be eligible for RAD if it requested but did not receive yet tenant protection vouchers, or if it awarded but did not yet execute a demolition contract. The other item was that we've given PHAs a longer 3 months to determine once it's got, if in some situations where it's gotten approval for both programs for a property, we've given them 90 days to determine which route it will be taken. If there's anything else. Okay, we'll go on to the next section. Resident rights. So this notice goes a long way in enhancing in specifying notification requirements for residents. So first, prior to application, and actually before you even meet with residents, part of an application requires at least 2 resident meetings. Prior to that, PHA must issue a RIN, a RAD information notice, to inform residents of their rights in connection with a proposed conversion and give them a basic outline of the conversion. The PHA should also at this time be issuing a GIN for if it's required under the Uniform Relocation Act. Next, after the application has come in, oh, hold on a second. We've also identified certain things that should be discussed at the 2 resident meetings that are outlined on the next page. Whether the conversion will include a transfer of assistance, the scope of work, this is not going in order here, plans to partner with an entity other than the PHA, any change in the number of configuration of units that might impact the household's ability to reoccupy the project, and any de minimis reduction of units which has been vacant for more than 24 months. Once a PHA is in the program and has a CHAP, previously the notice just said, well, you have to have at least 1 resident meeting before closing. Clarified that there needs to be at least 1 more resident meeting before the submission of the financing plan. And then additional meetings if there are any material changes to the conversion plans. We also require that within the financing plan, the PHA submit responses to resident comments in connection to the meetings held following issuance of the CHAP. I believe that's it on resident notification. One pretty major change we made related around to rescreening, the prohibition on rescreening. We extended the authority a little bit more broadly. So already current public housing households with converting projects cannot be excluded from occupancy based on any rescreening or income eligibility or income targeting. We're applying that same premise if those current public housing households will be returning to non-RAD PBV or non-RAD PBRA units at that property. So relatively frequently in RAD conversions, PHAs and their partners are putting other assistants at the properties, other deep assistants at the properties, and using RAD authority where exempting any rescreening that would normally occur if a family were moving into one of those units. But please note that while this change is intended to facilitate the right of the return to the assisted property, such families and such contract units are otherwise subject to all applicable program requirements and are not otherwise subject to any of the RAD alternative requirements. Also on resident rights, we've fixed calculation error that existed for a few years related to the phase-in of tenant rents to make sure that the phase-in is more evenly distributed across the years.
Does it go backwards at all? It's just
So that correction applies for all conversions. Yeah. We've provided some more guidance on how to transfer waiting lists. I don't think there's any new requirements here, but suggestions on some best practices of going from one form of waiting list to another. We've also corrected a small item related that was in an appendix on the notice of termination of lease, clarifying that the requirement to ensure that residents, clarifying that residents generally receive at least 30 days of notification unless there's a health or safety risk, or if a state or local law requires a shorter period. Okay, that's it for resident rights, and we'll take another break, see if there are questions on that. Well, Gabby, you're on. Gabrielle Van Horn, you're off the line. You're on your.
Yeah. Hi, Will.
Hey.
Hi. Good to talk to you. I have two questions, actually. So one question was related to what you were saying about flexibilities. I think that you just said that if the family's TTP is going to exceed the gross rent, or the tax credit max rent takes precedence, either way, they're going to pay 30% of their income. If that is not following the 50058 calculations, should we be doing what we're doing now for RAD phase-in, where we use a PHA use only field to capture what the RAD calculated rents are? Because the calculation that you're saying can't be done using the existing project-based 50058.
Yes. Right now we've got some instruction out there on how to use a field in the 5.8 to record the actual rent a tenant is paying for project-based vouchers, under project-based vouchers, and you would continue to use that field under these provisions.
Okay, and then my other question is about that percentage for phase-in, which you just briefly touched on. It sounded like you just said that we should now be using that phase-in for everyone moving forward, the new phase-in percentage calculations. Does that apply retroactively to people who are already in phase-in, or only for new projects that have closed?
Yes, we're permitting it retroactively. I think we might need to put a little further guidance on how you do that, but where folks have asked whether, in many cases, this is how PHAs were doing it anyway, because it was the more intuitive way of calculating it. And in some cases, people were following the letter of the notice. And where folks have asked if they can correct that retroactively, we've said yes. They said that we might need to put a little bit further guidance out there on how to, if there are any transition issues to address.
Yeah, and if you could, when you're doing that last point, just also speak to if there are any limitations to, you said that MTWs could have some flexibility, so if you can provide guidance when you're speaking to that also, that would be great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Phil, you're on the air.
Yes, I typed in my question, so sorry about that. You responded already. Thank you.
Oh, great. Okay. Okay, there's a question about the RIN. Can you clarify, is it required in writing like the GIN? Yes, the RIN is a letter. And I believe we have a kind of a working sample on our website. We pull it down every so often just to when we identify an improvement to be made. But if it's not there now, it'll be there shortly. Just it gives you a starting template that a lot of housing authorities will be able to use. Obviously, it's just a template, so you should make sure it's appropriate for a specific presentation that you're making to housing to residents.
Well, in this transition period, this is Bev speaking, in this transition between the RAD 3 and RAD 4, RAD 2 and RAD 3, and if people are already past this point, do they then have to give a RIN at whatever point they're at now, a resident notification?
So the RIN was actually introduced in the Civil Rights and Relocation Notice,
okay.
November. And I believe we said yes, just provide it as soon as you are able to. Okay. Obviously, not everyone is out of compliance automatically because they apply immediately. Okay, I'll go on to the next question. To facilitate the right of return. Okay, so there's a question of if you're developing a property with both RAD project-based voucher units and non-RAD project-based voucher units, the person submitting the question understands that the household would not need to be rescreened if moving into one of the regular PBV units. If they would be under-occupied, though, is there would they be permitted to remain in such a unit? The answer is yes, as long as there's not a more appropriately sized unit available. But as soon as there is an appropriately sized unit available, they would need to move to that unit.
That would be true of PBRA as well.
Yeah. So there's a question, if the PHA has already held 2 tenant meetings and its findings plan will not be submitted for another 60 days, do we need to hold another resident meeting or distribute RINs? Yeah, you don't need to hold another resident meeting, but we would, excuse me, hold on a second. If in your financing plan, you would need to submit any resident comments and your responses to those comments that occurred in at least one meeting that occurred between chat and financing plan, and more meetings if your plans have changed along the way. So as long as you can satisfy that requirement, you're okay. You would not. You should also, if you haven't done so, distribute RINs just to make sure the families are aware. The RIN does not need to necessarily invite the residents to another resident meeting if there's no need for another resident meeting. Question, want to verify that the community service requirement will no longer be applicable if a RAD property converted to project-based vouchers or to PBRA. That's correct. There's no community service requirements in PBV or PBRA. question, if the tax credit rent is less than the gross rent, does TTP exceeding gross rent now result in rent to owner being less than the gross rent? I read that question out loud, but I'm not sure if I can answer it still. So, Kevin, I think we'll have to get back to you on some of those questions. Okay, let's move on to the second to last section of this presentation. Thanks all for sticking with us. You champs. Loosely categorized, improving processing. Okay, most of these are pretty fast. We've eliminated the RAD application requirement to secure a letter from the tax credit issuing agency. So this is a requirement that existed if you are pursuing 9% tax credits in your RAD application. You'd either get a letter from the tax credit issuing agency, or if you couldn't get that letter stating that your application is something that they generally look at favorably or something along those lines, then submit a self-scored QAP. Now you can just submit self-scored QAP. You don't need to try to get a letter from the HFA. For CHAPs that are involving 9% tax credits, PHA must submit evidence that it's applied for tax credits within 30 days following the application submission deadline. The grace period still exists, so just a refresher of the grace period that we expect you to apply for the first 9% round that has an application deadline outside of 90 days from your CHAP issuance. Now this notice revision just says when you are then expected to have applied for 9% tax credits and submitted that application, we would need to see evidence that occurred. The financing plan, in addition to, this is connecting the dots, not only do we require now a submission of the resident comments and your responses in the financing plan, we also require the title reports to be submitted with the financing plan. And this is because we've seen a number of cases where the title report coming in late in the closing process has often uncovered things that added significant delay to the closing process itself. For the funding in the year of conversion, as many folks know, properties are reliant on the operating funds and capital funds that continue to support the property during that year. We used to have a more complicated process in which that amount was calculated and moved to a certain budget line item in locks. And we've significantly simplified that so that it's stricter proportional calculation of the units converting versus the total units in the AMP. We're no longer requiring or pretending to require that the funds need to be moved in locks. Instead, HUD will periodically publish the maximum amounts that could be available for converted properties, those funds don't need to be reflected in any particular location in locks, though PHA should be reflecting those transfers in their financial reports.
Capital funds are the same as they've been, right? Can we the requirements for the capital funds are still the same as they've been.
And as Bev points out, the requirements under the capital fund have stayed the same. So the amount is still calculated and identified in the initial year funding tool, and those submissions still come in through the closing coordinator, and those funds do get moved in locks. Another clarification is just as there's been some confusion between RAD and FHA. So the RAD use agreement must always be recorded prior to the security instrument or any other mortgage or security instrument relating to an FHA insured loan or risk share loan. And finally, we've replaced a post-closing cost certification with a post-closing completion certification. This is really the because we want to make sure that the be able to follow up to make sure that the requirements of PCC were met. And that's something we are developing now and we'll be putting out for public comment and use in the coming months. Why don't we storm through the last few changes, and then we'll go back to questions at the end of the presentation. We have included a section on lead-based paint hazards. This doesn't impose any new requirements at all. This simply is a brief summary of the requirements that owners would be subject to under lead-based laws. The only new item, it's more of a process requirement, is that today under the public housing program, PHAs are required to have lead-based paint inspections and a lead risk assessment on their properties. Those documents, if available, the PHA should be providing that to the CNA contractor so that that can be incorporated into any scope of work, and to make sure that the owner's responsibility to treat lead-based paint hazards is included in the scope of work. Otherwise, all of the existing lead-based paint regs apply, and this is really just meant to highlight that for folks to remember. We've also added a encouragement for PHAs and their partners to grant current workers whose employment positions may be eliminated during conversion the right of first refusal for new employment openings for which they're qualified. This is not imposing any new requirements, but just an encouragement for PHAs to consider those transition issues. Lastly, on relocation and civil rights, there are a number of changes in the notice that really just align to the RAD Fair Housing, Civil Rights, and Relocation Notice. One, a reminder that the PHA is responsible for ensuring that any upfront civil rights reviews and relocation activities are conducted in accordance with that notice, and any approvals needed are received prior to financing plan submission. That notice contains everything you need to know about relocation that occurs under RAD. Reminder, do not relocate residents prior to RCC. And we have a number of trainings on that notice that are available on the resource desk for folks who might be new to it. I think that is it. Before we go to general questions, just to point out that make sure that if you have questions about how the revision 3 might affect your specific transaction, if you have a chap, to send those questions up to your transaction manager to make sure that the context and nuance is captured. Otherwise, certainly general questions can come through RAD@HUD.gov. Okay, let's see if we have any more questions, either hands raised through the webinar tool or any written questions submitted. There's a question, what if the physical needs assessment exceeds any chance of raising those funds? What is the housing authority to do? There's not any silver bullet that HUD has. Soon we will be releasing a CHAP amendment guide that provides a little bit of a checklist for PHAs to make sure that they've taken advantage of every rent flexibility that we have to offer in our cost neutral demonstration. For properties with extensive needs, the PHAs may want to consider Section 18, where HOTMA actually makes it significantly easier for PHA to project-based vouchers back in units that have gone through Section 18, which might be able to support rehab or new construction. Let's see if there are any other questions. We have a question from Ron Law. Hey, Ron, sorry, you're on the air.
Yeah, thanks. Regarding the having to record the RAD use agreement ahead of the security instrument, is FHA now fully on, or multifamily now fully on board with the procedure for allowing that and doing that?
Yes, Ron, we are one HUD, and we act in concert. And so, yes,
that's good to know.
We have internal clarification on that topic. Thank you.
Thanks.
And if you find somebody that doesn't know about it, it's telling you something different, come to us in headquarters and let us know.
Okay. Any other questions? We've got question about if you hold resident meetings and nobody comes, you're required to have additional resident meetings until somebody comes. Certainly, we encourage you to advertise your resident meetings well. One of the functions of the RIN is to make sure that every resident gets a specific letter that, this is a little bit more complicated when you're midway through the process, but for a PHA that's starting from scratch, that every resident is receiving a letter that invites them to a meeting and tells them a little something about RAD. If you do put your best effort forward to advertise resident meetings and you're not getting any responses and you're following all the accessibility requirements about meeting locations and languages and things of that nature, there's no requirement that you have to have meetings that people attend.
Meaning a meeting where nobody attends counts as a meeting.
Yes. Let's see if there are any other questions, either written or if anyone is raising their hands.
So, Will, some questions that have been submitted are extremely lengthy that it's sort of hard to deal with on air. Will we try to respond to them?
Yeah, we will go through these and see if we can provide written responses to the individual questions. It seems to be a little bit more transaction specific or complicated to walk through over the phone. But so if you submitted a question and you're frustrated because we haven't answered it, you'll get a response. We have another question from Ken. Ken, you're on the air.
Okay, it's not about the change. It's just we've got a property that we just approved. We just closed on the RAD, but it's going to be under construction for a year, and the folks, we're trying to figure out how we report those units in VMS, and the folks on FMC aren't sure. I was hoping somebody on your side might know.
Is it an immediate conversion or is it delayed half?
Okay, I'm budget guy, so I'm not really sure. We're getting the funding as the rehabilitation. What do you call it? You call it RAD rehab assistance payments.
Okay.
We're getting that for 12 months while it's being constructed.
And so first thing is, have you seen the RAD PBV quick reference guide?
A long time ago, or I'll look at it again.
So take a look. It should, we need to update it a little bit. It's a couple years old, but the basic premise still applies that until if the subsidy for the property is still coming out of the public housing program, you should not be reporting in VMS. Once HUD adds a new increment of voucher funds to your voucher ACC, which happens after the year of conversion, in the first full year following the year of conversion, at that point you would be reporting in VMS.
Well, that's where we are, because it closed last calendar year, and we're getting an increment. And we got it starting in January, which we now have to submit our VMS report, and we can't figure if we have to identify any units at all anywhere on there because they're not occupied.
I see. Ken, could you make sure to send your question into rad@hud.gov, and we'll
Sure.
circle back? Thank you.
Okay, we'll do. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question from Dolly.
Yes, hello?
Hey, Dolly.
Hi. We were already on RAD, and we were having a question about funding. I don't know if that's a question that we could ask here.
Sure.
But how is the funding supposed to be calculated? Is it the same way that it is on Section 8? Because, or is it, we were told that it was going to be our contract rent minus the PUM, and what we receive after that would be, quote unquote, the HAP payment, and that's how it would be calculated.
And when did you convert?
November 1.
Okay. So I think your question is about, so you've converted last year, you're now funded from new Section 8 funds. I'm presuming this is project-based vouchers.
Right.
You got a lump sum of voucher money, and you're scratching your head and saying, how did HUD come up with how much money they need to give us?
And everybody has a different answer.
Okay. Well, let me give you the fifth answer. We did our best guess of estimating what you would need this year. We took your contract rents from your HAP contract. We subtracted what our best records of what tenants were paying from last year's operating fund forms that your agency submitted. We made some assumptions, and very modest assumptions about vacancy and about your OCAF increase, and came up with a number. Inevitably, that number won't be perfect. It is first slug of money meant to cover the first, I believe, 3 months. You'll get another slug of money to cover the rest of the year. And you'll also, the FMC will also be surveying you later in the year to say, how did the money compare with your actual costs? And there will be an opportunity for reconciliation.
And when does that happen? Like towards the fall, or?
Yes, I believe they send those out in September and try to get at least 8, usually 9 months of data.
Okay, so in next year, will it be based on that same kind of formula, or will it actually happen? Will it be from our actual cost?
But by next year, it'll be based on what you report in VMS. So
okay, all right, so a little more accurate.
Yeah.
I'm glad I asked. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, we'll ask Jennifer, you're back on. Jennifer, you still there? Okay. Anything else before we wrap up, or we've taken our allotted time? We will see if there's any more pressing questions. But otherwise, we'll answer anything else we receive just over email. Okay, I think that is all we'll address over today's session. Thank you very much for your time and patience. Please feel free to send us more questions or to send your questions up to your transaction managers and who can be very helpful in these. And thank you all. Have a good one.